Hi, everybody. I'm going to give you all a moment to start to get settled and comfortable. And I'm really happy that you're with us. We're really grateful for your time. Anytime you spend time with us, and especially on today, we have a really great program planned for you. And I want to give folks a moment to join, and then I'll introduce our incredible panel and also the folks behind the scenes. Yes, Alison, thanks for asking. The recording will be available to record. The recording will be available to view later. Annie, are closed captions available? Let me see. I don't think I have the option currently of turning closed captioning on, but I'm going to ask Holly, can you take a look and see if there's a setting or anything we can do to make closed captioning available? Thank you, Holly. Holly is checking on closed captions. And if we cannot get closed captions working, we will definitely send a transcript after. I know that's not the same, but we will certainly do that at a minimum. So okay, so let's go ahead and get started. I want to say welcome again to today's program on faith and journalism, and thank you for being here. I'm Julie Moose. I'm the executive director of the National Press Club Journalism Institute. And I say we because I'm joined behind the scenes by Beth Francesco, who is deputy executive director of the Institute, and Holly Butcher-Grant, who is growth manager for the Institute. And you'll see them both pop up in the chat if they haven't. Holly already has. This program comes on a day when the Supreme Court has announced a ruling that will resonate in many different ways for people of faith. How will people of faith be covered in stories about the response to the ruling and its potential impact? Will they believe coverage of their perspectives was accurate? Will they see their neighbors reflected fairly? We are not going to be discussing those questions directly, but they add urgency to this conversation if we want a broad range of Americans to trust that journalism reflects their experiences and concerns. We are recording the program, and the video will be on our website, and we will also send it to everybody who's registered, and we will be providing highlights of the program as well in coming days. So if you miss something, don't worry, you'll have a chance to catch it a second time. We really hope this will be a conversation, and we'd like to hear your thoughts in the chat. We would like to hear your questions in the chat and in the Q&A queue. We'll be monitoring and responding to them throughout the program. Before I introduce our incredible panel, I want to thank two organizations that have supported us in this programming. I want to thank the Gannett Foundation for their support of programming related to diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging in newsrooms and in journalism. And I want to thank the Deseret Management Corporation for their general support of the Institute, and particularly their interest in faith and media programming like this. So again, we're glad that you're here. We're also missing a few panelists who plan to be with us, but are dealing with COVID and Supreme Court coverage and other challenges. So we still have an overabundance of talent here, and this will primarily be a conversation among them with some prompts from me. So I'm going to introduce them, and then we're going to get started. We have Dawn Araujo-Hawkins, news editor at Christian Century and vice president at Religion News Association. We have Alison Bethel, founding editor-in-chief at State Affairs. Sarah Breaker, editor at Moment Magazine. McKay Coppin, staff writer at The Atlantic. Richard Flory, executive director at the University of Southern California Center for Religion and Civic Culture. Aisha Khan, editor at Next City, freelance journalist and Harvard Divinity School graduate. And Holly Meyer, religion news editor at the Associated Press. So thank you all. We also may have a few family members in the background that pop up every once in a while, which is completely welcome. And we thank them for being so patient with us and for being present too. So let's go ahead and get started. And let's start with trust. Trust among sources, potential sources, readers, viewers, listeners, and trust within our news organization. So Dawn, can you get us started? And then Holly, and then Alison.
Sure. Thanks everyone for being here. Yeah, I think for reporting on religion, trust becomes such an important topic, and it's always important in journalism, as I'm sure you all know. But religion is so held so tightly to people that I think there's often a lot of fear, and I'm thinking primarily among sources, that you are not going to tell their stories accurately. And what I always like to share is when I started at Global Sisters Report in 2014, which was a media platform. It was the National Catholic Reporters kind of online vertical for Catholic nuns, specifically talking about Catholic nuns. We had such a hard time initially getting women religious, the nuns, to want to talk to us, despite the fact that the National Catholic Reporter had been around since 1964. Most, if not all, of the nuns that we reached out to were longtime readers and fans of the National Catholic Reporter, but they had been so burned by, I think, primarily secular media, that they were spooked by the media in general. So we would call, and I would call and ask questions like, I just want to talk about like your ministry. Let's talk about this thing that you're doing. And they would not want to talk. And it took years of hand holding, of walking them through the process of like, what is this interview going to be like? Calling them back to read back their quotes to them to make sure that they were quoted accurately, because they were so afraid of their words being twisted, or their community or religious life or Catholicism being twisted in a way that was not what they expected. That it was a surprising hurdle, I will say, because we're like, we're Global Sisters Report. This is what we do. We are about sisters, and they were still like, I don't know. I don't know if I want to do this interview. So yeah, I think just because faith is so personal to people, and because it can get glossed over, because you can't possibly report on every nuance, that people can be a little scared to talk to reporters when it comes to religion.
Yeah, that's some of my experience too, Dawn. I'm also thinking of readers. When I've received a few emails from clergy, and they're like, I clicked on your story, Holly, thinking you were going to get it wrong. And I was pleasantly surprised to find out you got it correct. And so that speaks to this mistrust of news coverage of religion. And how do we sort of overcome that? It doesn't seem like there's a shortcut that we can take. It is experience and consistency. I have all of my training is on the job, baptism by fire, as they say, and certainly have made mistakes along the way. But how I have sort of improved my skills is three ways. One of them is going directly to the sources themselves. People have an enormous capacity for wanting to spend time with journalists, at least I've found, to make sure we understand them and get their experiences correctly. I've relied on folks like Richard, experts in the field who will spend so much time with us to make sure we can detail those nuances correctly, because often the story in religion, because it's so complicated, the story is in those details. And so you need to be well equipped to be able to convey that clearly to readers who don't probably know, even if it is their own faith, the nuances of what's going on. And then I've found tremendous value in the Religion News Association, just the network of support from these experts who are friendly competitors. Don't get me wrong, we love to win in terms of scoops, et cetera. But it is also just this really supportive environment. If you're like, I need you to help me explain why Episcopalians don't like to be told they're not Catholic, or not Protestant. And so they will gladly give of their time to explain the minutia, the little details, so you can better convey that.
Thank you.
I think Don and Holly are right on the money. I think internally, as news organizations, we have to do a better job at covering religion just in general, and choosing who covers religion and how we cover religion, because I think we've done a really, frankly, horrible job of covering it, and that makes people not want to trust. Sorry, someone's mowing. Not want to trust that we will get it right. A good example is that we. Do you want to come back to me, Julie?
Sure. But
Can you?
are you worried about the noise?
Yeah,
Okay.
unless you can hear me, then I'll continue. But
We can hear you, but that's okay.
Okay.
We can, yeah, go ahead.
so one example is people who are Christian and who believe in Jesus Christ as the Son of God, dying on the cross and rising again in 3 days, are evangelical by the very definition of evangelical. But our newsrooms, reporters have taken the word evangelical and used it in such a way that the general public would think that evangelicals are white men or women in the Midwest who are racist, who are, instead of looking at what the word really means and what being an evangelical means. So I think that we have to look inward first to get it right, so that we can have have people, readers, trust us with getting it right and not twisting or mocking their belief.
Yeah, that's a great point. And I shared specifically on the subject of evangelicals with thanks to Richard, whose center actually produced the guide. I just shared a guide in the chat, a link to a guide in the chat that was designed for journalists to help understand a little bit more specifically on American evangelicalism. So I want to turn to you, McKay. You've written about your own faith as a member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, a faith that is often mischaracterized in the media. Can you talk a little bit about what you see in faith coverage, and also about your own experience in newsrooms following on Alison?
Yeah, it's interesting. My experience is one where I began as a political reporter covering my faith tradition primarily through the lens of presidential politics. I was covering Mitt Romney's presidential campaign in 2012 and was really just kind of a political reporter. And in as much as I would write about or report on Mormonism, it was when it came up as a campaign issue in 2012, right? And so I did that for a number of years. I would kind of write about the intersection of politics and the Latter-day Saint community. And then as I gained more experience, as I kind of shifted into writing more long-form magazine pieces, as I started writing more essayistically in some cases, I began to write about my own experiences in Mormonism too. And I will say, like, that experience was kind of difficult for me at first because I had really worked, especially early in my career, to report on Mormonism from a purely objective standpoint, right? I was writing about it as a journalistic observer who obviously had a probably more than average knowledge of the faith tradition, but I was still writing about it purely journalistically. So kind of pivoting to writing about it from my own viewpoint was hard, but I was lucky to be at a magazine where the editors kind of encouraged that. They wanted to hear from people of faith. Their argument when they kind of assigned me to write a big piece about the 200th anniversary of Mormonism a couple of years ago was basically, your own story should be part of it, right? And so that was a fortunate experience. It's not one that every person of faith in a newsroom is going to have. But what I have found personally, and I know this is not everyone's experience, is that while newsrooms are by and large pretty secular places, probably much more secular than the country at large, they also are places where most journalists are curious, right? It's full of curious people and people who want to learn. And I have been fortunate that most of my colleagues, whatever their backgrounds were, have come to me wanting to know about Mormonism and about my experience. And when I covered Mitt Romney's presidential campaign, I would get kind of aggravated by how many dumb mistakes there were in stories about his faith, about the candidate's faith. But I also found that most journalists were quick to make corrections when they were called out on those mistakes. And when I was kind of on the campaign press bus with 30 other reporters from all these different outlets, I picked up the nickname the Mormon Wikipedia, because all these reporters around me would they would say, hey, I'm writing a story about this issue that just came up. I don't understand what the Mormon teaching is on this. Can you just explain it to me really quickly? And that kind of became my role. I'm glad I was there to do that. But it also underscored to me how rare it is to have a Latter-day Saint voice in those kind of settings, and why I think it's important, not just in Mormonism, but in general, to have people who have real experience in various faith communities to be there. The one last thing I will say is that, obviously I'm talking about writing about and reporting on my own faith tradition, but I will also say some of the reporters who, in my experience, did the best job covering Mormonism, both in that during that campaign and just in any other context, were people of faith themselves, not Latter-day Saints, but people who had at least had either grown up in a faith tradition and still had some connection, whether they were still practicing or not, because they took it seriously and they knew that there was a level of nuance and detail that was required to do a good job with that coverage. And that's why I don't just
I think you froze, at least for me. Yeah.
Julie, can I just say to McKay's point?
Sure, go ahead. And then I'm going to actually ask Aisha to weigh in on the nuance question, but go ahead, Alison.
No, go ahead, because I was going to make a comment on that.
Well, go ahead. That's okay. And then I'll ask Aisha.
I think a big takeaway, or McKay still tried, not realizing he's frozen. A big takeaway for me from what McKay said is that he actually
I would be fine with.
Go ahead, McKay.
Oh, wait, we got you back. You froze, McKay, so we were losing you, but go ahead, unmute and come back and finish, and then we'll do Alison and Aisha.
No, sorry about that. And I should apologize up front. We ended up having some travel issues, and you caught me right at the end of a road trip to the beach with my family. No, I was just the point I was just making at the end is that what I found is that people who have had any kind of lived experience in religion, regardless of what their tradition was, have generally approached Mormonism, which is the faith tradition I know best, with more care and nuance than other reporters. That's not always true, but it's why I always advocate for more people with any kind of religious experience being in newsrooms, because I think it benefits all religious people and all faith traditions.
Excellent point. And I put, as we were talking about this, as we were preparing for this program last week, I was listening to you and thinking about this idea that, as we value diversity, we want to also value different faith experiences in newsrooms. And so we did a poll question just a moment ago, asking participants who are here with us today about whether their news organizations do think of faith as a dimension of diversity and inclusion. And I think there was an interesting, maybe about a third, Yes, no, we will consider it now. So way to make some change. Thank you. Let me go. Actually, I want to go to Aisha to stay on this topic of nuance, especially. So Aisha, congratulations. You just recently graduated from the Harvard Divinity School and also started a new job as an editor at Next City and have been a freelance journalist. So can you talk a little bit about what you're seeing in faith coverage, both as a journalist and as a practitioner?
Yeah, so I spent several years covering American Muslim communities as my beat, and that's actually why I ended up going to divinity school, because I felt, I had spent several years covering my own community and my own religious tradition, but I was increasingly realizing that there was a lot I didn't know about it, and I know about us, and who comprises that us, and what traditions and beliefs comprise that us. So for me, it was important to go back and get that foundation in understanding the immense and rich diversity within the religious tradition of Islam, right? Or as many people would argue, Islam's plural, and it's the same across the board. And so I think increasingly I'm realizing that, as McKay said, taking religion seriously, if that's our aim, and if we want to be taking lived religion and people's lived religious experiences seriously, we have to be understanding that vast diversity within religious traditions and recognizing that none of them, not Mormonism, not Islam, not the Catholic Church, not evangelicalism, none of these are monoliths, right? None of these words and none of these people correspond to the very easy shortcuts that we attempt to take as journalists by describing people as conservative Christian or devout Muslim or evangelical or liberal. We use these labels, we use these shortcuts and attempt to describe our sources, our interviewees, entire communities of millions of people in this way, as if our readers are supposed to know what that means, as if there is an easy definition of what what each group's theology is and how it drives their politics, their activism, their morals, their beliefs. And I think in taking these shortcuts again and again and again for years and years, we've trained our sources and our readers to expect that lack of nuance, right? And to expect that, we're going to take these shortcuts, we're going to take these, we're going to use these neat categories and descriptions to illustrate huge swaths of people and their ideas, as if there is like a clear-cut archetype of what these people are, what a conservative Christian is. And so our sources, even if they trust me as an individual journalist covering religion, especially because I'm covering Muslim communities, I'm visibly Muslim, people often do have a connection in that sense and trust me to do a good job. But they still have an understanding that they should be, in talking to me, that they should be glossing over the nuance, right? And I think that's especially the case among minority communities who are used to being covered by mainstream publications, or, by, if it's a religion-oriented publication, it's still one that's primarily covering Christians or understands religion in a Christian sort of framework. And so being used to that, they're also, in talking to us, glossing over that nuance. They're reducing their stories down to the talking points that they think we want to hear and they think our readers want to hear and are capable of understanding. And they don't want to be cut down by the editor, right? So they just try to stick to those clear talking points that they think will actually make it through to print, right? And I think as journalists, we have a responsibility, if we are taking religion seriously, to stop our sources as they're doing that. If we hear them doing that, we should stop them and say, like, hang on, wait, explain that to me. When we hear them saying like, oh yeah, there's actually a lot of opinions about this, but moving on, right? Like that doesn't matter to you, so moving on. We should stop them. When we hear them saying like, yeah, there's a lot of debate about, this issue like abortion, whatever it might be. But you don't care about that. You can't print that. Your readers don't want to hear that. Your editor won't let you publish that. So moving on, we should stop them and say, like, actually, I really want to know. I care about that. I think it's important for our readers to understand that, to be literate in this idea that there is not just one idea about abortion among Islam. There's not just one idea about abortion among the Catholic Church or about Mormonism, right? Like, McKay talked about the Mormon teaching on something, but that's not necessarily reflecting the lived experiences of every Mormon in this country, right? And that's something that we have to be cognizant of. And we have to make sure that our sources and our readers believe that we will respect that.
May I add one small thing about that?
Yeah, please. And then Richard will come to you.
Because just mentioning shortcuts reminded me, I think as reporters, we have an obligation to kind of work on diversifying our sources. If I read a headline and I know it's about, anti-Semitism on college campuses or Jewish views of school choice, I know exactly who's going to be interviewed, and I probably know exactly the order they're going to be interviewed in. And, for readers, I think when they see their religion or their denomination basically being expressed through or filtered through one or two people, often maybe the loudest or the squeakiest wheels, it really, erodes the trust that you guys were talking about.
Yeah, I just want to chime in on some things that I should touch on. And then first, I take it as one of my tasks when I talk to reporters to tell them about Nuance, because I know it's hard for them to have that. And so if I don't know something, I'm going to tell them you need to go talk to somebody else. But this is a usual, our staff laughs at me because they know what my answer will be. A question will come up and I'll say, well, it depends. And it depends on a lot of things. And one of the issues I think is the tension here is that there is, when you talk about religion, you can talk about individuals and individual faith, and you also need to talk about institutions and organizations, and those don't necessarily line up. They kind of do and they kind of don't. And so that ends up being a tension for people reading, for sources. Even in my work, which is not exactly the same, obviously, but it's getting people to talk about things. And so you do have to take, I think the word you use is shortcuts, but it's like, I would say we categorize things so that so that they can be framed in a different way. And the report that Julie, that you linked, we say, look, there's five types of evangelicals we can identify, but there's a lot of border crossing. So you'll find people that or even if somebody's an evangelical and they read it, that they could put themselves in two of these camps, and then that becomes interesting. It's like, how does that work out? And what's that like to live in that space? And what's that like to go to a church when you feel this kind of ambivalence about some of the things going on? From week to week. So I think I understand the need, the desire, and the need to reduce nuance, but at the same time, I'm happy to introduce it to you. Not that I'm asking all of you to call me, but I think that's a role that people like me, the researchers like me, can play, is to say, and whether it comes out in the story or not is not our issue, but it's like at least we can do is to spend the time to provide the broader frame. And one last example that's not very controversial, which is a good thing right now, is spiritual but not religious. I'm completely and totally annoyed with that category because it means everything and nothing. And everything gets stuck into it of people that don't go to an institutional religious organization. But nobody asks, what does that mean underneath that? And from our research, it means I don't want to offend my parents or my grandparents, and I'm on my way out. I actually I have some practice, but I don't really do anything about it. Or I think I know what you want to hear from me, so I'm going to tell you this thing back, but it really doesn't mean anything in my life. One young person we talked to literally said to us, yeah, we asked, what do they think about that, and do they identify that? They said, no, I always thought that was a Miss America answer. Meaning it's intended to not offend, but it doesn't really tell you anything unless you dig underneath and go, what do you mean by that? So I think that tension is always going to be there, and between individual and institution, and also this sort of um, loss of nuance in the service of explanation of what really you do have to do in the end.
So thanks so much for saying that. And I think one of the things as we were preparing for this that I was looking at was this new Gallup research that shows belief in God. This is the headline: belief in God in US dips to 81%, a new low. And I was so struck because, first of all, 81% sounds really high to me. For 81% of Americans to do anything sounded very high to me. But also, you, I know, Richard, have done research on what it actually means, like what people really mean when they say that they believe in God, what they actually believe in, or what they mean when they say they pray. And I think, I think we might not be able to get into that right now, but I guess what I want to just sort of draw out of that too is, as journalists, when somebody says something to us about believing in God or praying, just like we would with many other things, it's really helpful to ask what they mean. What do you mean? Tell me more about that. Can you elaborate? How does that show up in your life? Can you give me an example? All the standard questions we would ask, but to McKay's point, apply that curiosity. I think we have a question. If I understand this right, I think we have a follow-up question about spiritual but not religious. So I'm going to actually bring somebody on with us. Guest.
Somebody got offended at my claim.
No offense. No offense. A follow-up.
I'm just kidding.
A follow-up question from the religion editor at the Washington Post. So thanks for joining us, and go ahead, unmute, and go ahead and ask what you were going to ask.
Oh, sorry, got the mute. Hello. Well, I don't want to hijack the conversation here, but one of the things we struggle with in coverage-wise is talking about a group that's been called the nuns. And so my ears perked up when you talked about spiritual but not religious, because, it's a growing group of people. We have one reporter who feels like we shouldn't write about them because it's like the sports section writing about people who don't watch sports. But we have another person who thinks we should, but the definition sort of what religion is becomes really amorphous. Like Richard was saying, almost to the point of meaninglessness. Like, are they people who are Peloton fanatics, or
yes.
Are they people who've sunk themselves into politics? Like what? Because essentially, like, it's about a search for meaning, and that can be defined 10 million ways. And then at what point are you left religion land, coverage wise? So, and that group is also, numerically large, right? But not cohesive in any way. And so it makes it hard to write about them, which is complicated because I know we talked a little bit about covering evangelicals. It's not that they're not a large group, but it helps a lot that they're a lot more cohesive than like the nuns. You know what I mean? It's a lot easier, but in some sense, maybe they get overcovered because they're easier to write about than this mishmash of people over here.
Yeah.
So I was just curious to hear how everybody deals with the larger trend in faith in America, which is this sort of turning away from institutions and everybody's doing their own thing, and how you write about that as a religion.
Can I make a data claim here, which is, it's a question. What group is growing? The people that are not attending services anymore, or the spiritual but not religious? Those are different things. So right. I'm saying it's a definitional issue. So one group is growing, the other one is a residual category that people claim, and nobody really knows what's underneath that, because people like me haven't done the hard work of defining. And I was talking to a friend of mine who's a journalist and a historian, and we're like, this needs to be, spirituality needs to be defined better by scholars. Well, what does it mean? Does it mean actual practice? Does it mean a good feeling? Does it mean any? And that right now, that's the case we're in. It's like, it means all this stuff. So and that's part of the issue. Part of the frustration is that there's that definitional issue, and then a label gets applied to people that don't go to church or synagogue or mosque anymore, and says, "Oh, they're spiritual but not religious." Are they? First of all, do they claim it? And secondly, what does that even mean? And so this is the nuance question, by the way. It's like, how do you get underneath and figure out where people are, or is it that most people just don't care, that are dropping out, just don't care? It is not literally a part of their life enough for them to reflect on it unless you ask them about it, and then they have something to say about it. It's a fascinating category. I totally agree with you, but it's like there's so much work to be done in it that I think we're at a place where you're right. There's no institutions of not going to church other than bars on Sunday morning or something.
So I want to continue this thread and also bring Sarah in. And I'm going to share something that Menachem Wecker just shared in the chat too. The bigger question, just so you all could be thinking about it, that I'm going to ask Sarah to address, and then everybody, that I think this raises, is who is religion journalism for? Who are we trying to reach with this? Who have we, Don is like getting ready, whose experiences have we centered? Who have we marginalized? And who are we trying to reach? Menachem says, I'm sure many of us have had the experience of interviewing somebody who claims to be totally not religious, only to find out later in the interview that the person is a good deal more engaged than previously thought. And so some of this is diving into what people mean by these labels that they either apply to themselves or reject. Mm-hmm. But let's go back. Sarah, I'm going to start with you, and then others feel free to chime in. This question about who are we trying to reach, and who are we leaving out? And also, what effect maybe does that have on trust? But I know that was just 3 questions. So just start with who is it for?
Well, just in terms of who religion journalism is for, I mean, I think, we've seen there's a real hunger for religion journalism out there. Just in talking to friends who work in other newsrooms, often their religion stories are, the ones that get the most clicked, the most traffic. You can also see kind of with discussions that are happening online, often the religion stories are the ones that people are talking about. When I was, starting out in my career, I feel like the discussions, in these panels were always like, should there be a religion beat? Should, newsrooms even talk about religion? And some people could disagree with me, but I think that's not really a question anymore. I think, we know that religion's important. Whether, editors are going to put their resources behind it is another question. But I think we've seen that, these are important. In terms of sort of who's being centered, I think, when newsrooms are covering Jews, I think there's a tendency to cover, ultra-Orthodox Jews for better or worse. Part of it is, I think there's this view that they're more authentic, more real, which often means that, when there's a question about, what's the Jewish opinion on X, Y, and Z, people will often go to, Orthodox Jews to give their opinion. We've seen this a little bit now with discussions about abortion bans and religious freedom. And Jews, some Jews saying that it violates their religious freedom for an abortion ban. And, I see often that progressive Jews, their faith is not taken seriously. It's viewed as, oh, they can take it or leave it, or they don't have a deep theology, when that's, not always the case, or that's often not the case, I want to say. And then, the other side of that is, I think there is this kind of maybe lurid fascination often with ultra-Orthodox Jews. And sometimes that fits into, reporters or people's preconceived narratives. One example is at the beginning of COVID, there were a lot of articles published about how Hasidic Jews are, these super spreaders, and, they're not, they're refusing to do anything to mitigate COVID. And the reality is, once you looked at sort of the data afterwards, their numbers were exactly the same as every other, low income population in New York City. And I think but that narrative still holds. I mean, people still tell that to me now. And I think it's because it fits some sort of preconceived notion that people have.
Yeah, this raises a really important point. I'm going to ask Dawn and then Holly to weigh in on this too. I mean, I think you've raised a few. One is this question of sort of discernment about who gets to speak for a faith, which Dawn, I know, has talked about before. And there's also this question about sort of, you know, as you said, like there's sometimes this lurid interest. There's a little bit of exotification, if that's a word, that happens with some faith practices. And sometimes what we choose to explain as journalists will make something seem more foreign, as if people don't know what it is, as if people don't understand it, as if it's not familiar. Or as if they can't just Google it. So, I mean, there are some ways in which journalism, the language we choose, the things we choose to explain, can create a sense of othering when we're covering faith by defaulting to, you know, either something intentional or our own knowledge base about what needs to be explained. So, so I want to go to Dawn and then Holly. I think, you know, particularly as you do covering such a wide range of religion for a global news organization, interested in your thoughts on who this journalism is for too. But Dawn, you first and then Holly.
Oh, I think religion journalism is for everyone. I mean, I will give my personal, very unacademic, unscientific definition of religion, which is the way people view the universe and their place in it. So to me, that is anything that falls under that category is fair game to me as a religion reporter. And who cares about the stories? Everybody, that's for everyone. There's so much to understand. I mean, that's really what drives me to do my job. Like I am so personally just obsessed and fascinated by how people answer that question. That sometimes I like honestly cannot believe this is my actual job to do this every day because I love it. But I think when you start asking those questions in almost any type of story, what you get from people and what you learn about your neighbors, about the world is just so deep and fruitful, even if it's not part of an organized religion. So religion journalism to me is for everyone. I mean, it's so much of what motivates people, even if it's not, I would say like front and center, you know, the people who are answering Richard's polls and like, don't, you know, like I'm not part of an organized religion. I don't think about it. But most people have an idea of like, what am I doing here? Even if it's nothing, even if it's just nothing, that's an answer. And just how that motivates people is just endlessly fascinating to me. And why we're not spending millions and millions of dollars funding religion journalism is beyond me.
Okay, we'll work on that one. Holly, do you want to add anything?
Yeah, I agree that religion journalism is for everyone. I'm going to invoke someone I saw in the chat, Liz. She has this great saying, we put it on RNA swag, religion is always in the room. And I think that religion makes people uncomfortable, including journalists. And so what we need to do is when religion comes up in the room, whatever room that is, to don't ignore it, don't look away. That's an opportunity for follow-up questions. Be curious, be sort of, I guess, empathetic to wanting to understand why someone is saying something, why they're believing something. I am reminded of, I was at a craft fair the other day, walking past cute booths, and there was this maker selling tarot cards. She like drew them, and I was like, oh, this is a religion story. Come to find out, the Washington Post already did it. Sarah's great story on tarot cards. I loved it. I revisited it as a result of that. And so I also have a fairly broad definition of religion, or a generous definition of religion. I find the way people approach, even if it is sort of a DIY faith, fascinating, especially as we see like crystal shops pop up near my favorite plant stores, etc. So I would just encourage, because one of the things that is needed to have full-time religion coverage is money, right? And that is often hard to come by. And so if we could encourage all journalists to not be afraid of when someone says, well, I prayed when I was standing on the roof of the building waiting for the helicopter to come rescue me from the floodwaters, ask more about that. And, to ask little questions. We're talking about how complicated religion is. And so, yeah, there's a lot of pitfalls along the way, but you can start adding nuance to your stories in simple ways. Someone says they're Christian, ask what kind. If someone says I voted for this policy, and they're also talking about how their Christian teachings influence them, include that in the story. And so I think there are little ways that we can start moving all journalism more towards including how religion is moving the world around us. And so we just have to be aware that it is important and to move forward.
I'm so glad you raised that because one of the things we know, and McKay, you experienced this when you were covering politics, and then also, Romney and others have seen this as well. As you said, Holly, it's what Alyssa's saying, religion is always in the room. There are people who cover this as a beat. There are publications that cover this. Many of you work with them. And there are people who cover politics and education and crime and all kinds of things where they are talking to people of faith. They might or might not know that. And that faith might or might not be a consideration, right? So what do you want to say to them? What do you want them to know?
Yeah, this is such an important point. I'm glad you steered the conversation this way, because I think that one of my concerns about quote unquote religion journalism is the fear of compartmentalizing religion journalism into its own distinct category that can kind of like sit over there in some section of a website or magazine or newspaper, while the rest of the world is covered through a purely, non-religious lens, right? When I think the reality is that, to the point others have made, the religion intersects with almost everything we're covering, right? Either because the people involved are people of faith, or because religious institutions are involved, or religious ideas and doctrines are under, kind of at the base of big things that are happening in the world. And so, I do think that it's important for newsrooms to realize that, right? For us to realize that there's always a religion angle to every story. On the other hand, and I know I'm providing my own counterpoint here, but it's because I'm always thinking about this and kind of debating this. On the other hand, I wonder sometimes if I go too far in only covering religion as it intersects with my other beats, right? So I'm primarily a political reporter, political journalist. So I cover presidential campaigns, I cover White Houses and various, political issues. And so when I write about religion, it's usually, not always, but usually when it intersects with politics. I think that's probably one of the most common genres of religion journalism we see. It's religion and politics. That's a huge, important story. But I worry that, the overemphasis on religion and its intersection with politics in the media has left a lot of readers with the impression that huge swaths of religious life in America are just about politics, right? like if there are people I know, journalists in various newsrooms who I talk to, who think of evangelicals as a political voting bloc, and that's it, right? Who think that, Catholics and evangelicals are primarily engaged in abortion, pro-life advocacy. And the reality is lived religion is so much deeper than that, and so much more textured and so much richer and more interesting than just its political manifestations. And so that's why I think ultimately it is important to have religion desks and, reporters who are entirely dedicated to covering religious life, because they can cover religious people and religious communities on their own terms, right? You can show that, yes, there are these interesting political angles to Catholicism or evangelicalism or Islam, but there's also interesting ways, humanizing ways to show how their faith has carried them through tragedies, how their faith drives them to live certain ways, to do good things and bad things and complicated things, how it helps them navigate family life. And that I think is something that we could do much better at in the media.
Yeah, I'm so glad you said that. And I think it raises an interesting point, and there's a question in the chat about it. And Aisha, I think the question was addressed both to you and McKay, but McKay sort of just answered it. It has to do with essentially, and this is questions from Kimberly, the question of should reporters who are members of a particular religion, and her question is, be allowed to cover that religion. I think I'm going to frame it a little bit differently. I think, and I'll ask Aisha for you to weigh in, and then others if they want to. This question, it doesn't just apply to people of faith in newsrooms, but in this context, we'll talk about that. But we've seen it come up in other ways in newsrooms, that newsrooms want to diversify to be more accurate, more fair, to have better reach. And also newsrooms get nervous about once they have a more diverse group of people, actually letting the news be influenced by different perspectives, by who we talk to, by what the framing is. And so there can be this push and pull here where we bring in people who have different lived experiences to newsrooms, and then we are inconsistent about whether we value and make decisions based on their lived experiences about what's a story, who would be a good source on this. That framing might alienate the people that you're writing about or that you're trying to reach. So I'm going to ask you, Aisha, because the question came to you and McKay, to weigh in, and then I would love to hear from others on that as well.
Yeah, to me, it's almost like a question about like, if you're a living person, can you cover living people kind of thing? You know what I mean? Like, we all have these experiences that shape us. To pretend that we don't is, I mean, just we're lying to ourselves, right? And I mean, it slots into this bigger conversation about like, does objectivity exist? Is that what we're trying to aim for? This sort of mythical idea in journalism, or are we trying to just reflect what's happening in this country and interrogate what's happening in this country, what we're seeing? And I think, yeah, I mean, we're seeing like more and more DEI initiatives where we're trying to get more diversity, more minority voices in journalism, more people from low income backgrounds, and the list goes on, different people who traditionally may have not had access to careers in journalism, and to be able to reflect, you know, the dynamics that they're experienced, that they've seen and that they're seeing within their communities. And I think this, to me, this goes back to the question about like resources and what are editors willing to fund and to support, and not just as a one-off story now and again, or a one-off vertical, or a little project now and again, but as ongoing, like robust areas of coverage. And to me, I'm not seeing that that's really happening enough. You know, there are some initiatives, and within those, like I mentioned earlier, a lot of these religion journalism sorts of projects, we often see that they have a very strong focus on Christianity, whether that's evangelicalism or Catholicism, Mormonism, and different sorts of branches of you know, the Christian tradition. Where is the coverage about Hinduism in America? Like, there's so many incredibly fascinating, you know, dynamic issues emerging the Hindu diaspora in this country, caste has sort of broken out into a discussion that's coming through actually through the tech beat, right, in this country, and like what's happening in Silicon Valley. And so that's finally getting some coverage. But because we don't have like a strong, robust publication that has like, people dedicated to covering Hinduism or South Asian religion in general, like we don't have a place to go to see like trustworthy, reliable, nuanced coverage of these communities. Hinduism is getting a little bit of, a breakthrough moment in that sense, right? Because of caste, which again, there's a sort of exotic, I don't know, fetishization or something happening there. But where's the coverage of like Sikh communities? Where's the coverage of Buddhist communities? I was so disheartened, recently there was an incident in which a Buddhist activist self-immolated in DC recently as a climate change protest. I didn't really see any significant religion journalism coverage of that, right? Which is just really, it's disheartening. And it shows where our priorities lie within the industry, within the field of religion journalism as a whole, which is, it's still emerging. It's still, there are still hiccups and funding issues, as we know. That's what I would say.
I think religion is fundamentally a belief system. Protestants believe the same thing, and that's what unites them. They believe in the same thing that's in the Bible. That's a very basic bottom of it. How they manifest it, what kind of churches, what kind of things they do in those churches or rituals that they do could vary and be different. If you are a reporter who is Catholic, I see no reason why you can't cover the Catholic Church. As an African American, I would hate for someone to tell me I can't cover a Black community because I'm Black, as though everything, I think is going to be exactly the same as the next Black person in that community. We may have a fundamental base agreement as African Americans, or we may not, but we may believe a certain way, but I think that's a flawed kind of way to look at it. I think when you have reporters who are bold enough where to let their newsrooms know that they are Catholic or Jewish or whatever religion they are, particularly if they're a religion that doesn't have a dress to it, so there's not like, they're not wearing a certain thing that would immediately identify them as Muslim or Jewish or whatnot. But if your newsroom, if you are open enough and feel comfortable enough because your newsroom has said that this is a part of diversity, equity, and inclusion that they embrace, then if you're covering that religious group, I see no problem with that, because it, by saying there is a problem implies that you would somehow be biased because you have a base belief of what some other Protestant group believes in. But I just want to say one last thing that Richard really reminded me of. I think when we cover religion and we talk about trust in religion, we have to understand, again, that it's a very personal thing and people believe it deeply. People who we cover, who say they're religious or they belong to a certain denomination, they believe it deeply, and it really informs how they live their lives, morally, politically, maybe, and that is deeper than kind of a surface reporting. And if you are able to understand that or empathize with it or even embrace it, then I think you have an opportunity to really have someone talk to you in a real meaningful and honest way about religion.
Thank you so much for that. And I just want to clarify, Kimberly's question wasn't should or should not. she was interested in how folks would respond to that challenge, and I think you all have responded really well and thoroughly. So I know there was so much else we wanted to talk about and plan to talk about, and I would love to stay and talk with you all about it. And I also respect your time and everybody's time. It's been a really, really interesting conversation, and I'm so grateful to you all. We hope that this is just the beginning, that we will have many more conversations on these topics, on either narrow pieces of them or more general approaches like this. And I appreciate so much everybody being here, and I appreciate so much jumping in unplanned in some cases, and all of the thought that went into it. And I want everybody to know how much we are grateful for your time. And we are gonna, again, we will send out a link to the recording. We will also send out links that were in the chat today. If you had a question that wasn't answered, we will try to get answers to that as well. And we will use those questions to plan future programs too. So thank you all again so much for being here and for all the great questions. And thank you to our amazing panel again. And we'll hope to see you guys soon.